For thousands of years, people have told stories about strange experiences that we cannot explain. Stories that conflict with our understanding of reality. Some of those stories found their way into print, to be read by hundreds, thousands, or even millions of readers before being consigned to the oblivion of the archives. In this series, we dust off forgotten newspaper clippings, magazine articles, and letters from the library of the late Gary Mangiacopra, one of the most prolific collectors of strange stories in the world. Join us as we uncover the forgotten secrets of the archive.
Before we begin, I'd like to welcome the newest member of my family, my niece Claire. In the unlikely event that she watches this video someday, I'd like to give her a little snapshot of the world as it is right now, in June 2024. Trudeau is Prime Minister, Biden is President, Charles is King, Francis is Pope, Russia is at war with Ukraine, Israel is at war with Palestine, gas is $1.57 per liter in your hometown, AI is getting amazingly good, the Edmonton Oilers are playing the Florida Panthers for the Stanley Cup, the biggest podcast is the Joe Rogan Experience, the biggest YouTube channel is Mr. Beast, the biggest film in theaters is a Garfield movie, and the biggest song on the radio is I Had Some Help by Post Malone. Viewers, if I'm leaving anything out, let me know in the comments below. Roughly half of Box 4 of the Gary Mangiacopra Archive is dedicated to the 1956 movie Unidentified Flying Objects, the true story of flying saucers, the first professional documentary on the UFO phenomenon. In what looks to have been a massive research project on this seminal film, Gary collected newspaper clippings, corresponded with UFO witnesses and U.S. Air Force personnel who participated in the film, and transcribed video interviews of individuals associated with the USAF's Project Sign, which the film chronicles. Gary's research seems to have culminated in a 60-page essay, a summary of which we will include later in this piece. For the past 7 years, the US government has been uncharacteristically transparent about its formerly secret investigations into unexplained aerial phenomena, mysteries of the stratosphere, more commonly referred to as unidentified flying objects, or UFOs. Catalyzed by the New York Times 2017 revelation that the US Defense Intelligence Agency had studied the phenomenon in the late 2000s and early 2010s, and culminating with the Pentagon's 2021 UFO report, and a handful of congressional hearings held the succeeding year, the government's recent efforts to acquaint the public with its scientific interest in, and defense-related concerns regarding these celestial enigmas, contrast starkly with its previous 50 years of silence. For 5 decades following a 1966 congressional hearing, prompted by a wave of flying saucer sightings reported across America, the US government rarely commented on the UFO phenomenon, or acknowledged its existence, relegating the subject in the eyes of the American public, either to the realm of conspiracy theory, or the land of the absurd. Some viewers familiar with Uncle Sam's classic taciturnity regarding the UFO phenomenon might be surprised to learn that there was once a time when the US government spoke frankly to the American public about the mysterious lights and shiny metallic objects seen gliding swiftly and silently through their airspace. With the exception of wartime concerns about Foo Fighters, mysterious aerial lights reported by Allied aircraft pilots during World War II, US government interest in UFOs began in the late 1940s, prompted by pilot Kenneth Arnold's famous 1947 sighting in the Washington Cascades, and the disturbing 1948 death of Captain Thomas F. Mantell in Kentucky's Pennyroyal Plateau. Following a shadowy period in which the US Air Force, with its projects Sign and Grudge, launched investigations into UFO sightings in relative secrecy, the USAF launched the highly publicized Project Blue Book, an enterprise with the expressed purposes of investigating the nature of UFOs and determining whether they pose threats to national security. On July 29, 1952, 4 months after the project's initiation, General John A. Samford, the director of U.S. Air Force Intelligence, conducted a press conference at the Pentagon during which he stated, "The Air Force interest in this problem has been due to our feeling an obligation to identify and analyze, to the best of our ability, anything in the air that might have the possibility of threat or menace to the United States. In pursuit of this obligation since 1947, we have received and analyzed between 1,000 and 2,000 reports that have come to us from all kinds of sources. Of this great mass of reports, We have been able to explain the great bulk of them to our own satisfaction. We've been able to explain them as hoaxes, as erroneously identified friendly aircraft, as meteorological or electronic phenomenon, or as light aberrations. However, there have been a certain percentage of this volume of reports that have been made by credible observers of relatively incredible things. It is this group of observations that we are now attempting to resolve. At the forefront of the Air Force's efforts to brief the American public on their investigations into flying saucers was a former reporter and Marine Corps veteran named Albert M. Chop, who worked as press chief for the Air Materiel Command from 1946 to 1951, and at the Air Force press desk at the Pentagon from 1951 until 1953. In 1956, Chop's career as an Air Force public information officer, with a focus on his spokesmanship for Project Blue Book, was dramatized in a film by Clarence Green and Russell Rouse called Unidentified Flying Objects, the true story of flying saucers, the first unsensational treatment of the UFO phenomenon to hit the silver screen. Early in this semi-documentary, an actor playing the part of a U.S. Air Force officer interviewed World War II veteran and American Airlines pilot Captain Willis T. Sperry, played by himself, who claimed to have nearly crashed into a streamlined object with a blue light at one end while flying near Mount Vernon, Maryland, on the evening of May 29, 1950. The object was flying head-on at us, said Sperry of the anomaly. It was 50 times the magnitude of the brightest star. I immediately made an abrupt turn to avoid collision. As I looked to my left, the object appeared to come to a stop. It appeared as a perfectly streamlined object without wings or a tail section, as it was silhouetted against the full moon. At all times, it had a brilliant shimmering blue light in the nose. It was traveling at fantastic speed, and although it had passed off our left wingtip, it circled us in a matter of seconds and appeared off our right wing. There again, it stopped, and we watched it for several seconds. When again it started, it reversed its direction. We watched it for several more seconds until it disappeared in the east out of sight. Later in the film, Albert Chop, played by actor Tom Towers, interviewed 2 different UFO witnesses who managed to film the objects they saw. The first of these was baseball coach Nick Mariana, who filmed 2 bright silvery objects flying over Great Falls, Montana on August 15, 1950. The second was U.S. Navy photographer Delbert Newhouse, who shot a series of lights traveling in formation just west of Tremonton, Utah on July 22, 1950. The witnesses themselves appeared in the film, and the motion pictures they shot were shown. The movie reached its climax with the dramatization of a sensational flap of UFO sightings made over Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1952. During one of the sightings, made on the night of July 19th, Chop joined radar personnel in the Washington National Airport and witnessed them attempt to guide a pilot through a fleet of UFOs to safety. More than half of Box 4 of the Gary Mangiacopra Archives is dedicated to this film. Folder 12 contains correspondence between the aforementioned UFO witness Captain Willis Sperry, who appeared in the film to detail his sighting near Mount Vernon, and James E. McDonald, an avid UFO investigator who worked as senior physicist at Tucson, Arizona's Institute for Atmospheric Physics. In one of his letters, Sperry alluded to a second UFO sighting he had in Illinois, on which he refused to elaborate, writing, "About the second incident that occurred near Chicago, I'm afraid I will have to renege. To convince people that I saw something unexplainable with many witnesses to confirm the sighting is acceptable, but if I come up with a second incident, I'm afraid people, especially in my profession, may raise an eyebrow a little too high." Folder 9 contains correspondence between Gary Mangiacopra and Al Chop himself. Near the end of one of his letters, penned on September 29, 1996, Chop wrote a haunting line. The Green to which he refers is film director Clarence Green, co-creator of the 1956 film that dramatized his career as an Air Force PIO. Chop wrote, "Green gave Library of Congress a copy of the film for historical purposes. I believe he correctly envisioned the film would become a really historical item on the saga of UFO, and I become more convinced that it will be as time goes on. UFOs are simply not going to go away. Someday, we will have the answers." Another interesting item from Folder 9 is a hand-drawn copy of the Peanuts character Snoopy in astronaut gear, made by Peanuts creator Charles M. Schultz especially for Al Chop. Back in the 1970s, when he worked as manager of NASA's Motivation and Training Division, Chop had arranged for Snoopy to become the mascot of the NASA safety program. Beneath the drawing, Schultz wrote, "For Al, with friendship, appreciation, and good memories. Charles M. Schultz, Snoopy." Chop referenced the illustration in one of his letters to Gary, writing, "Regarding the Snoopy astronaut drawing, Charles Schultz made it especially for me. You have the only copy. If you decide to use it, you need only to be certain the copyright is printed with the pics as follows. Copyright United Features Syndicate." Folder 1 contains transcripts of video interviews of Albert Chop and Willis Sperry, conducted by Thomas Tulane and Brad Sparks as part of their Sign Oral History project, for which they interviewed UFO witnesses and former government personnel involved in the U.S. Air Force's Project Sign. These interviews are transcribed by Gary Mangiacopra himself. In his interview, conducted in March 2000, Willis Sperry gave another account of his 1950 sighting, less varnished than his testimony in the film, saying, "I was writing something in my logbook. The co-pilot yelled, 'Hey Doc,' he said. 'Doc, get a look at this thing.' And I look out, and I saw the weirdest looking goddamn thing that I ever saw. It really was a weird looking operation. I had no camera, no nothing, and pretty soon he just took away, like bing. Just like that, he went whoosh, gone. He was right alongside us for a while." Sperry later described the object as cigar-shaped, more akin to a flying submarine than an aircraft. During the interview, Tulane and Sparks alluded to a detail about Sperry's compass malfunctioning, which the pilot presumably told them off-camera. Sperry also added that a number of passengers saw the object as well, and that it seemed to issue some sort of exhaust vapor. Later on, allusions were made to Sperry's appearance on journalist Paul Coates' TV program Confidential File, on which he took a lie detector test. In his own interview, conducted in November 1999, Albert Chop explained that he initially believed that all UFO sightings could be rationally explained when he was first appointed a press spokesperson for Project Blue Book. He described how journalists often asked him about UFO sightings that the Air Force was not aware of. He recalled how his skepticism gradually began to erode throughout his career, vanishing completely on the night of July 19, 1952, when he witnessed radar personnel at Washington's National Airport track 7 UFOs spotted south of the city and correspond with Air Force pilots sent to intercept them, an incident which served as the climax of the 1956 film. "The fact that these things were so clear on radar," he said in the interview, and the guy that Major Dewey Fournay brought with him declared that as far as he was concerned, those were real objects up there. No ground clutter or nothing. And the fact that when we had an intercept come in, and those things vanished. The very instant that we could see the planes coming in on the radar scope, and the minute we saw the beginning of these guys, the UFOs just disappeared. They just left, and these planes hung around. We sent one up north, one down south, different parts of Washington. Nobody saw anything, so they finally said they're going back to base, to Newcastle. We could see them go off and on the scope, and the minute they got off the scope, bang, here's the UFOs again. You know, I was very apprehensive about that. In fact, I was scared. I don't mind telling you this. It scared me. It was frightening. And I think everybody in the room was like that, very apprehensive, because of the fact that whatever these things were had intelligence enough to get out of the area when they had an intercept going in. They had to be intelligently controlled. Chop went on to describe the most alarming event of the night. About 3 hours later, when we got the second intercept up, they sent one guy up round to the north part of the city. He didn't see anything. But Patterson, down in the other quadrant down here, flew right into the middle of 4 of them. And he actually said, "They're closing in on me. What shall I do?" Well, what the hell is he gonna do? What was I gonna tell him? I'm a civilian. I'm not gonna tell an Air Force pilot to fire at the damned thing or anything. I didn't say anything. Nobody said anything. And all of a sudden, these things began to move away from him. And he said, "They're gone." And the next minute or two, he said, "I'm returning to base." And he did. He didn't know what the objects were. All he knew was that they were there, and that's what convinced me. I'm convinced that these objects do appear, and we don't know exactly what they are. Neither does the Air Force, unless they know and aren't telling me. I'm convinced they're solid objects. I'm convinced that they're probably from another planet, from outer space somewhere. I always felt that way since that night, and I can't help feel that way. I think if anybody who went through it like I did would feel the same way. Chop later related that the aircrafts scrambled to intercept the UFOs over the capital were based out of the Newcastle National Guard Base in Delaware, as the runways of the local Balling Air Force Base were under repair at the time. It seemed to me like somebody had intelligence about that situation, he said, and put on a show. Later in the interview, Chop described a handful of particularly interesting cases he investigated with his superior, Major Dewey Fournay. One of these, which took place in Fairfax County, Virginia in 1951 or 52, is too interesting to leave out here. They habitually went to the grocery store on Saturday to buy groceries for the week, said Chop of the witness to this particular event, because in addition to the farm, the fella had a job somewhere, so they would go shopping on Saturday night. This particular Saturday night, they got home from the store. It was evening, dark, and there was father and the mother, and they got in the house and the mother asked her husband if he would take a look up at the hen house, because the chickens were making noise, and she said she smelled a snake. She said a snake gives off an odor, which she was familiar with. She thought there was a snake out there, so he went out the back door and walked down toward the chicken pen, and he noticed a big moon out that night. And right over some trees, they were in the back of the farm, was another object. It was almost as large as the full moon, and there were 4 or 5 little objects circling around the big object, and he stood there and watched it. He called his wife, and she watched it. At that time, their daughter came home. She was on a date with her boyfriend, and they came home, and they were looking at them too. Somebody called the Fairfax County Police Department. They sent a car out with 4 officers, came up to the farm, and these objects were still there, orbiting around the big one. And they all witnessed this thing until about midnight. And they sat there and watched this thing, these objects, until dawn. And then they just merged and took off. The report should be in the police department files at Fairfax County Police Department. Gary's research into the 1956 UFO film seems to have culminated with his composition of a 60-page essay, which can be found in the archive's Box 4, Folder 1, Item 3. The following is a condensation of that article, compressed and narrated with the help of AI technology.
In the decade preceding the 21st century, those interested in the subject of unidentified flying objects had access to an abundance of video content on the topic. With cable channels like PBS, Discovery, and the Learning Channel occasionally airing programs on flying saucers, and national programs like Unsolved Mysteries and American Journal featuring segments on UFO encounters, there was no shortage of material. One significant documentary from this era was the 1956 film Unidentified Flying Objects, The Story of Flying Saucers, which was the first detailed full-length documentary on UFOs released to the American public. Despite its groundbreaking nature, many UFO enthusiasts today are unaware of its existence or the background behind its production. Back in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the UFO phenomenon was a new and captivating subject for the American population. Radio programs and early television channels reported on sightings, some TV programs focusing exclusively on UFOs. Unfortunately, many of these early television programs are now lost, either recorded live or on primitive kinescope copies. It wasn't until 1957, with the introduction of videotaping, that more television programs were saved and stored. Even then, however, many tapes were erased and reused due to short-term economic considerations. Despite the growing popularity of television, many people continued to go to the movies, where newsreels occasionally featured Air Force representatives dismissing UFO sightings as misidentifications of air balloons. In the 1950s, Hollywood began producing science fiction films about space travel and UFOs, sparking public interest in the topic. However, there were no serious documentary films exploring the possibility of extraterrestrial visitors until UFO, The Story of Flying Saucers, in 1956. This film was ahead of its time in its attempt to provide a factual and serious treatment of the UFO subject. Despite the success of Hollywood science fiction films, major studios were hesitant to produce a full-length factual documentary on UFOs. Hollywood had a close relationship with the U.S. military in the 1950s. Jack Warner, head of Warner Brothers, had made patriotic films during World War II. During the Cold War, he produced Big Jim McLean, which depicts the United States being invaded by Russian communists. Other studios received help from the military for war-themed films, being careful not to jeopardize this relationship by upsetting their sources. Howard Hawks wanted to film a science fiction movie, The Thing from Another Planet, with military assistance, but the Air Force refused due to its flying saucer theme. Hawks decided to create the project without their help, resulting in a classic sci-fi film. Independent filmmakers like Clarence Green and Russell Rouse, known for their 1950 film noir DOA and their 1951 drama The Well, took risks with unique ideas. DOA was a success, showing their talent with low budgets. The Well was based on a true story and dealt with racial tensions. It was praised but didn't win the Oscar. In 1952, they made Thief, a silent crime film starring Ray Milland, which garnered critical acclaim. The movie tells a Cold War spy story about a physicist who becomes a traitor by photographing top-secret papers for a foreign power. Uniquely, it had no dialogue, only music and sound effects. The success of The Thief led Clarence Green and Russell Rouse to create their 1953 film Wicked Woman, a low-budget melodrama praised for its gritty realism. Other of their films included the 1955 Confidential, adapted from a book on organized crime, and their classic 1956 Western, The Fastest Gun Alive. Of all of Green and Rouse's avant-garde productions, one film stands out as their most personal project. In the early 1950s, UFO sightings were widespread. Green, who had witnessed a UFO himself, was intrigued by these reports. He found the skepticism surrounding UFO sightings puzzling and decided to explore the topic in a film. Green's interest in UFOs led him to learn about Project Blue Book, the U.S. Air Force's investigation into the phenomenon. This sparked the idea for his and Rouse's next film, which would delve into this most controversial of topics. Albert Chopp, a key figure in UFO investigation, assisted Clarence Green and Russell Rouse with their film. Initially a skeptic, Chopp became interested in the UFO phenomenon after working on Project Blue Book, the same Air Force investigation which had piqued Green's interest. He provided Green and Rouse with classified reports and even acquired film footage of UFO sightings. Chopp's involvement led to the making of a documentary-style film about UFOs, which included interviews with eyewitnesses and experts. Produced on a low budget of $200,000 and directed by Winston Jones, the film aimed to convince the public of the reality of UFOs. It featured real people who had witnessed unexplained aerial phenomena with their own eyes, including Chopp himself, using non-professional actors and real locations to add authenticity. The film's narrator was Marvin Miller, known for his role as Robbie the Robot's voice in Forbidden Planet, and Harry Morgan, who later became famous for his roles in Dragnet and MASH, voiced one of the characters. Chopp's character was played by Tom Towers, a newspaperman with aviation experience. The extent of Green and Rouse's involvement in the screenplay of their UFO documentary is unclear, as they chose not to take credit for it. Screenwriter Francis Martin is credited, but Chopp, Fournet, and Ruppelt also contributed to the script. The screenplay went through several revisions, with a near-final version featuring stock footage of rockets and jets in the title credits. During the film's production, Green and Rouse initially faced skepticism from the Air Force, but eventually gained their trust by ensuring the film's factual accuracy. The film was kept secret during its 2-year production, a remarkable achievement in Hollywood. After completing principal photography in November 1955, the film was edited in secret. A final print was previewed to select individuals, including Tom Towers. The actor, in a letter dated March 30, 1956, expressed his initial self-consciousness about his performance, but ultimately praised the film and hoped for its success. The film was previewed to the press on April 23, 1956, with attendees required to keep the film's content confidential until its official release. Reviews varied, with some praising its journalistic approach and others finding it less engaging. Luella Parsons, a prominent Hollywood columnist, noted the film's significant public interest despite the mystery and ridicule surrounding flying saucers. UFOlogist Max B. Miller had mixed reactions to the film, finding it somewhat disappointing, but still recommended it to UFO enthusiasts for its inclusion of amateur UFO films. Miller believed the film was biased in favor of the existence of UFOs and lacked a skeptical viewpoint. Overall, the film generated significant interest and debate among the press and the public, with its portrayal of UFO sightings and its approach to the topic. The documentary made its public premiere on May 9th at the Fox Wilshire Theater in Los Angeles, attracting a significant audience. It grossed around $3,000 on its opening day, setting a record for attendance. However, subsequent showings did not maintain the same level of interest, leading to financial challenges for the film. In New York, a special preview was held, which received a more positive response from UFO enthusiasts. However, when the film was shown in Washington, D.C., the Pentagon prepared a response stating that the UFOs in the film were either jet fighters or seagulls, downplaying their significance. UFO received surprisingly favorable reviews when exhibited in the New York City area in mid-June. The Herald Tribune noted its aim to cultivate open-mindedness about saucers, and the Times found it quietly and effectively demonstrated that truth can be more engrossing than fiction. However, the Daily News was harsher, calling it a thoroughly factual account, but amateurish in presentation and provocative in subject. In Springfield, Massachusetts, the film received brutal criticism. The Union stated that the plot was restricted, and the producers had placed the movie more in the field of education than entertainment. The Daily was even blunter, describing it as a pictorial record of news stories on the phenomenon. When the film reached Boston, reviews were generally favorable. The Boston Herald found the film sober and careful, leaving viewers asking questions. The Boston Post praised its fascinating and absorbing nature, dealing with real people and no actors. The Boston Globe noted that the film was partly Chop's own story, adding to its narrative. In Connecticut, the Hartford Lyric Theater screened the film on June 2nd. Producer Green made a personal appearance to promote the film, asserting that flying saucers were indisputably real. Despite positive reviews, the film lost over $100,000. Its failure at the box office raised questions about its release timing and audience readiness. Despite high numbers of reported UFO sightings, the public did not flock to theaters. Some suggested that the audience wasn't ready for such a documentary. However, another flying saucer movie released later that year, Earth vs. the Flying Saucers, based loosely on a serious UFO book, was highly profitable, indicating that the failure of UFO might have influenced producers to opt for a science fiction approach instead. The juxtaposition of the two UFO films released that same year made it clear that the American audience preferred sensational fiction over serious treatments of controversial subjects. While national and regional newspaper movie reviewers generally praised UFO's documentary-style presentation, the Pentagon's film critics, particularly Captain George T. Gregory, were not pleased with its release in theaters. During April, as the film was being screened to selected press, the Air Force officer in charge of Project Blue Book, Captain Hardin, was replaced by Captain George T. Gregory, who was known for discrediting UFOs. Despite efforts to counteract any favorable public response, the film was released nationally. Air Force personnel, including Project Blue Book scientific advisor Dr. J. Allen Hynek, were ordered to attend sneak previews. One Air Force scientist, A. Francis Archer, supervised the case and assessed the documentary material. Despite comparisons between amateur footage from Montana and Utah and the Air Force's footage, Captain Gregory dismissed all reviews, notifications, and advertisements that could create problems for the Air Force. Negative publicity emerged later in the year when UFO negatives were allegedly not returned to a photographer and a newspaper columnist. The author first watched this film in the early 1960s when it premiered on the East Coast on New York City's Station WA Channel 9 as part of their $1 Million Movie program. This program showed the same film repeatedly throughout the week, with the announcer reminding viewers about the movie during commercial breaks. In the 1970s, UFO was occasionally shown on New York City's Channel 11 weekday movie matinee slot, with some scenes edited out. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the film was relegated to late-night showings. After a more than 10-year absence, the film resurfaced in the fall of 1995, included in cable channel TNT's 100 Weird Movies Marathon, hosted by Academy Award winner Jose Ferrer. UFO was sandwiched way between the science fiction films Overlords of Atlantis and The Devil's Plane. The film UFO, The True Story of Flying Saucers, is now available on YouTube. If you'd like to watch it, please click the link in the description.